I love August. It is probably my favorite month of the year. And a habit I've got into is that every year at the start of August, I promise myself to let the month be slow. Helping with this is a lovely poem I came across last week by Morgan Harper Nichols. She writes, "Even here you are growing, when August is approaching, and you feel a little restless, thinking about how this month might end, and how this year might end, and how you are supposed to start again. You are growing. You are growing in grace, courage, strength. Let July be July. Let August be August. And let yourself just be. Even in the uncertainty. You don't have to fix everything. You don't have to solve everything. And you can still find peace and grow in the wild of changing things." There is a wonderful blend of peace and power in these words. The peace of acceptance and rest, supported by the power of grace, courage, and strength. Peace and power. These are the themes running through our readings today. These are the themes that address the question of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. Now, I know that can be an awkward question to encounter. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? That's a much more demanding way of describing being a Christian. Because a disciple of Jesus, there's a level of specificity and commitment in those words that challenges us. Do we really need to do more than show up here most Sundays? Isn't there perhaps like a lower tier membership that we could take instead? One that's less rigorous? After all, looking around at the state of the world, there's just too much. Too much pain, too much anxiety, even simply too much life. It's just too hard. No wonder we crave a time for retreat and renewal, which is where we find Elijah in our reading today, literally retreating from the burden of following God and hiding out in a cave. This isn't Elijah, the bold and decisive prophet, raising the dead and calling fire down from heaven. This is Elijah at his most human, exhausted and afraid, unsure and broken. He needs a break. He tells God that he has been very zealous, tirelessly working to do God's will, and he is worn out. The people of Israel have ignored Elijah and rejected God. They've killed other prophets and they've smashed up their holy sites. In a most pitiful moment, Elijah moans, "I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Now, there's an important detail about this reading to bear in mind. This passage recounts a conversation between Elijah and God with no one else there. So we really only have Elijah's accounts of these events. I mean, for this conversation to have ended up in the first book of Kings, Elijah had to have told someone else about it. And that's important because right now, Elijah is not looking so great. He's complaining and hiding and utterly defeated. But I think Elijah can share this story and his miserable, self-pitying appearance in it because of God and how God shows up with one question that cuts straight to the heart of the matter. What are you doing here, Elijah? I love the directness and the simplicity of God's question. After all, we believe in and worship God as omniscient, all-knowing. And so God would already know why Elijah was there. But he asks anyway, to invite Elijah to share his perspective, to express his feelings, to voice his fears. God asks Elijah that question simply to bring Elijah into relationship with God. God asks in order to meet Elijah where Elijah was, literally and emotionally. Not where Elijah perhaps should have been, or where God would want Elijah to be, but simply where he was, in the mess and muddle of his fear and dejection. And this is perhaps one of the most affirming and reassuring things about God, that he desires more than anything else to have a relationship with us. So he will meet us where we are, no matter what that looks like. And then, almost as if to remind Elijah of the difference between human fear and divine presence, what happens next is a vivid reminder of God's peace and power. First, the elements rise in a fierce display. A great wind swept through breaking rocks. An earthquake shook the ground Elijah stood on, maybe fractured the walls of the cave he was hiding in. Fire raged, consuming everything in its path. This was the natural world at its most awesome, most fearsome, most intimidating. But this was not God. For God was in the silence, the sound of sheer silence. For God is not in the drama and the noise of the world. God is in the quiet. God does not overawe or bully Elijah with his power. He comforts him with his peace. This is yet another example of just how differently God sees the world. Where we might expect spectacle, God brings stillness. Indeed, from Hannah in the book of Samuel to Mary in the book of Luke, The Bible repeatedly shows us that God sees our world differently. And Jesus himself gives us numerous examples of what this looks like, from greeting the outcast tax collector Zacchaeus to conversing with the Samaritan woman at the well, including, welcoming, restoring. Looking at the world differently, as God calls us to, can be hard, but liberating. I recently read the novel Lessons in Chemistry. It's the story of a female chemist, Elizabeth Zott, set in the 1960s and depicting her struggles with how she sees the world differently. At one point in the story, Elizabeth finds herself hosting an afternoon cooking show on TV and refuses to play the traditional part assigned to her. Elizabeth insisted on describing salt as sodium chloride and water as H2O. She made coffee on a Bunsen burner, and she saw the women beyond the housewives. She saw the work and the toil they exerted every day. She saw the potential they contained. In one memorable encounter, she listened to an audience member who had stifled her dreams of medical school in favor of raising 5 sons. And Elizabeth coaxed her into acknowledging her ambition. "If you were a doctor, what sort would you be?" Elizabeth asked. "An open-heart surgeon," the woman replied, before she could stop herself. "But I can't." "Why?" "Because it's hard. And raising 5 boys isn't." Taking a different perspective, looking at people more deeply, seeing beneath the surface, including, welcoming, restoring. And then, God may meet Elijah in the cave, but he does not leave him there. As we read in 1 Kings, then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram." God recommissions Elijah and calls him back to work. And yes, God gives us work to do also. For if we see the world differently as disciples of Jesus, then we are called to work to heal the world with and for God. This isn't always dramatic or heroic, but it is all-encompassing. Remember Jesus' words to his disciples in Matthew chapter 25. "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." And the all-encompassing nature of God's call to us means that we can find all sorts of ways and places where we can fulfill that call and work as disciples of Jesus. We can find it on the TTC. As subway driver Alex Crawford did this summer. Or, as he's better known, Uncle Crawfy, whose cheerful and affable announcements have captured the attention and hearts of passengers across the city, cheering up the monotonous slog of their daily commute. You can catch recordings of Uncle Crawfie at work across social media, telling departing passengers that we miss you already, encouraging people to find a reason to smile, asking subway riders to remember the struggles of those affected by the Ontario wildfires, even as they might be complaining about the smoky sky downtown. Very appropriately, given this World Cup summer, on one day, Uncle Crawfie greeted his passengers by saying good morning in over a dozen languages. It might sound flippant and fleeting, but Uncle Crawfie's announcements brightened people's days, made their journeys that little bit lighter. And as Jesus teaches us, truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of one of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Because we're not always sent out to perform big tasks, but we are asked to accept the vital small act of reflecting our faith in the world. This is the promise and possibility of Paul's letter to the Romans, which in many ways mirrors Elijah's journey from cave to recommission. First, there is renewal and reassurance. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. God embraces us through the simplicity of faith in our hearts. Then there is the gentle, gradual progression that works backwards from the point of a person's belief to the vital presence of another who shared their own belief. As Paul wrote, "But how are they to call on one in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim him? And how are they to proclaim him unless they are sent?" So we are sent to reflect our faith in the world and find small ways to show that we see the world differently. And when we do, incredible things can happen. I read recently a minister reflecting on an adult baptism he had led. The person being baptized was a man who had spent over 20 years living as a committed atheist. When the minister asked him what changed, he replied, "Christians who kept loving me without needing me to change." As the minister reflected, no one argued him in. They loved him in. He was quite simply loved into faith. Loved into faith is how God greets each one of us, caring for us, renewing us, and calling us on. So that, as the poem said, no matter where we are growing in grace, courage, strength. Because courage doesn't begin with confidence, it begins with listening. Grace doesn't presume self-sufficiency, it affirms our human fallibility. Strength doesn't come from our own certainty. It draws on the power of the one who sends us and loves us and sends us again. The promise of our God who meets us in silence, renews us, and returns us into the world. Our God, who in these languid days of August wants us to remember, let yourself just be, even in the uncertainty. You don't have to fix everything. You don't have to solve everything. And you can still find peace and grow in the wild of changing things. Praise be to God.